When Deputy Harrison rolled up to my place that Tuesday afternoon, I doubt he expected much more than another petty neighborhood complaint. Instead, he was greeted by the sight of Margaret Peton, the 62-year-old president of the Metfield HOA, locked inside my fortified goat enclosure, shrieking at the top of her lungs while my champion Nubian goats happily gnawed on the straps of her designer purse. I kept my composure, sipping coffee like nothing unusual was happening, and explained in the flattest voice I could muster. Margaret took it upon herself to trespass again for one of her so-called unauthorized livestock inspections. I figured if she's that curious about farm life, she might as well experience it properly. I'm Robert Caldwell, 45, a former software developer who ditched the cubicle grind 3 years ago in exchange for 5 acres of open land. My property sits right on the edge of Metfield Estates, your classic suburban HOA development where people pay $300,000 for cookie-cutter houses and spend weekends policing each other's lawn heights with tape measures. When I bought this land, I figured living beside an HOA wouldn't be a problem since I wasn't actually part of it. My parcel had been here half a century before the subdivision even existed, and I triple-checked with the county to make sure their bylaws had zero authority over me. That should have been the end of the story. But then came Margaret Peton, a woman for whom the concept of property lines was apparently optional. She had ruled the Metfield HOA for 8 years with the kind of control most dictators would admire, all while wearing pastel sweaters that made her seem harmless. She was the type to prowl the streets at dawn with a clipboard, measuring fences and citing residents for bird feeders that didn't match the approved shade chart. Her husband, Harold, had long since stopped trying to resist. These days, he just nodded silently while she ranted about architectural compliance like it was gospel. Margaret had turned what was supposed to be a harmless volunteer role into her own miniature empire, ruling over Metfield Estates like a medieval tyrant armed with a laminator. And like all power trips, the conflict with me started small. The first strike came in the form of an official-looking letter on HOA stationery, informing me that my chicken coop violated their approved backyard structure guidelines. I replied politely that I wasn't a member of their HOA and therefore not under their jurisdiction. A week later, another letter arrived, this time accusing my rooster of violating the neighborhood noise ordinance. I mailed back a copy of the county's Right to Farm Act. Next, she decided my compost pile was an eyesore for anyone walking the trail that bordered our properties. That's when her reconnaissance missions began. More than once, I caught her perched on a step ladder with binoculars, snapping pictures of my tomato plants like she was working for the USDA. Then came the official complaints. She called the county, alleging my greenhouse was unpermitted. An inspector showed up, checked my paperwork, which was flawless, and left shaking his head at her nonsense. Not long after, she phoned animal control, insisting I was running an illegal petting zoo because a few local kids liked to scratch my goat's ears through the fence. The officer showed up, saw 4 goats and a dozen chickens, and basically told her to quit wasting their time. But Margaret wasn't done escalating. That's when she discovered drones. She splurged on a $1,500 DJI model and started flying it over my property every single morning at 7 a.m. sharp. The constant buzzing spooked my chickens into hysteria and sent my goats trotting in circles like some weird livestock parade. I asked her, politely at first, to stop. She refused, claiming it was all part of aerial boundary documentation for the HOA. By day 3, I decided enough was enough. One blast from my pressure washer sent her drone crashing down in pieces. She called the sheriff's office in a fury, but when Deputy Harrison showed up, he reminded her that repeatedly flying drones over private property could easily count as harassment. The trespassing began about 6 months back. One Saturday, I came home from the farmer's market to find Margaret inside my greenhouse, snapping photos of my tomato plants like some rogue agricultural inspector. When I demanded to know what she was doing, she claimed she was checking for signs of disease that might threaten the community garden. I told her to leave or I'd call the police. She did, but not before informing me that my heirloom tomatoes weren't on the HOA's approved vegetation list. 2 weeks later, I caught her at dawn, tape measure in hand, trying to size up my chicken coop. She insisted she had to confirm setback requirements. Once again, I reminded her loudly that her HOA rules stopped at her property line. She just smirked and said, "Everything affects property values. I have a fiduciary duty to protect the community's investments." The third incident was something else entirely. This time, she didn't come alone. She brought 3 fellow HOA board members and called it a formal inspection. They marched onto my property in formation, clipboards in hand, and barged straight into my barn while I was feeding the animals. They started photographing my feed storage like they were building a case for the FBI. That was the first time I called Deputy Harrison. He showed up, explained trespassing laws, and told him to leave immediately. Margaret complied, but not before declaring this wasn't over. After that circus, I installed security cameras covering every angle of my land, added no trespassing signs every 20 feet, and rigged motion-activated floodlights. I figured that would finally scare her off. I was wrong. The cameras started catching her sneaking around at bizarre hours, sometimes at 11 p.m. with a flashlight, poking around my compost bins, other times at sunrise, photographing my chicken run like she was on assignment for National Geographic. I archived every video clip, slowly building an evidence folder. Then she escalated again. Suddenly, she had an environmental consultant with her, who turned out to be her nephew armed with a clipboard. Together, they marched around my property taking soil samples and measuring structures while I shouted at them to leave. Each time I called the police. By then, even Deputy Harrison was getting weary and finally told me to seek a restraining order. So I did. Margaret fought it, insisting her HOA duties gave her the right to inspect nearby properties for potential compliance issues. The judge wasn't amused. He granted me a temporary restraining order that barred her from coming within 50 feet of my property line. You'd think that would have stopped her. Wrong again. Margaret simply got creative. She started photographing my land with telescopic lenses from the road. She even hired a surveyor, hoping to prove some of my structures crossed into HOA land. The surveyor confirmed exactly what I already knew. Everything was fully on my property. Undeterred, she petitioned the county to classify my farm as a commercial operation, which would have triggered stricter zoning. The county flatly told her that agricultural use was protected and predated the HOA's existence. Her campaign reached peak absurdity when she compiled a 50-page Metfield Agricultural Impact Report. She printed and distributed it to all 200 homes in her subdivision, claiming my modest farm was lowering property values, spreading disease, and luring vermin into the neighborhood. Margaret's crusade eventually reached the point of absurd theater. She even convened a special HOA meeting where she unveiled a slideshow of photos of my property, most of which were clearly taken from spots she had no legal right to be standing in. A few neighbors later admitted they were mortified by her antics, but no one dared challenge her. Everyone knew that crossing Margaret meant weeks, if not months, of petty retaliation. The final straw came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at the grocery store when my phone pinged with a motion alert from my security system. Pulling up the feed, I watched in disbelief as Margaret scaled my fence using a ladder, accompanied by two strangers lugging containers and what looked like testing gear. They'd already been on my land for nearly 20 minutes, strolling through my vegetable beds and photographing everything like they were part of some government task force. I drove home right away, but stopped at the gate instead of pulling in. On my phone, I tracked them as they made their way to the goat pen, where Margaret busied herself snapping close-ups of hoofs. Later, she would claim she was documenting hoof rot that posed a threat to public health. That's when I decided to end the farce. I walked up quietly, waited until they were all absorbed with the goats, and then slid the reinforced latch on the pen gate behind them. The enclosure had been designed to keep goats in, but was just as effective at keeping trespassers in. 8 feet of heavy-gauge wire mesh, a concrete footer so nothing could dig out, and a roof to deter predators. It might as well have been a holding cell. Margaret didn't notice right away, too intent on her bogus inspection. But when she tried the gate and realized it was locked, she absolutely lost it, screaming about false imprisonment and kidnapping. Her companions, who turned out to be her cousin and a book club friend, just looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them whole. I, on the other hand, kept things calm. I phoned 911, reported that I had 3 trespassers detained on my property, then settled into a lawn chair with my coffee to wait. Margaret alternated between threatening lawsuits and demanding release, while my goats provided the evening's entertainment. My prize Nubian, Bessie, developed a fascination with Margaret's designer purse, tugging at the straps, while another goat started nibbling her shoelaces, prompting fresh shrieks about assault by livestock. 15 minutes later, Deputy Harrison pulled up. He took one look at the scene, Margaret raging inside the goat pen while my herd investigated her accessories, and I could tell he was struggling not to laugh. I showed him my phone with security footage of them climbing the fence and wandering my property. I also handed over the restraining order she was blatantly violating, along with a neatly organized folder documenting 24 previous trespassing incidents. Margaret immediately tried to spin the situation, insisting that I'd committed false imprisonment by locking her in the goat pen. Deputy Harrison set her straight, explaining that property owners are well within their rights to detain trespassers until police arrive, especially when those trespassers are in clear violation of a restraining order. Her two companions quickly changed their tune. They started apologizing on the spot, explaining that Margaret had told them she had full permission to be there for official HOA business. When Harrison mentioned the restraining order, they looked stunned. They clearly hadn't signed up for a criminal charge. Backup was called, and within minutes 3 trespassing arrests were underway. As Margaret was led to the patrol car in handcuffs, she kept shouting about her rights as HOA president, claiming my illegal farm was tanking property values. She demanded to speak to the sheriff, the mayor, and even threw in a threat about calling the governor's office. By then, she was a far cry from the polished, pastel-clad enforcer the neighborhood was used to seeing. Her mascara had smeared, her usually perfect hair stuck out with bits of hay tangled in it, and muddy hoof prints covered her designer white pants where one of my goats had stepped on her. That evening, the story made the local news. The headline read, "HOA president arrested for trespassing on farm, gets pinned with goats." The broadcast even aired snippets of my security footage, Margaret climbing the fence with her ladder, then marching across my yard like she owned the place. Reporters interviewed a handful of Metfield residents, most of whom admitted they were embarrassed by their president's antics. One neighbor even said on camera, "She's been harassing people for years. Maybe this will finally teach her to respect boundaries." By the next morning, Margaret's mugshot was plastered all over the community Facebook page. Someone had already made a meme of her behind cartoon jail bars with a caption, "When you take HOA enforcement too seriously." It went viral, racking up over 3,000 shares in just 24 hours. From there, the story spread nationwide. A handful of websites that specialize in HOA horror stories picked it up, and soon Margaret Peton became the poster child for HOA abuse of power. The criminal case moved swiftly. Margaret was formally charged with trespassing, harassment, and violating a restraining order. Her companions, meanwhile, cut deals for community service in exchange for testifying that Margaret had misled them into believing she had authorization to be on my land. The trial was scheduled 6 weeks later, and Margaret came armed with a high-priced city lawyer who specialized in property disputes. She clearly thought money and bravado would save her. In court, the prosecutor rolled out my security footage, dozens of clips spanning half a year, each one showing Margaret trespassing on my property, sometimes alone, sometimes with her reinforcements. They also introduced her infamous 50-page agricultural impact report as evidence, painting it as part of her relentless harassment campaign. Neighbors were called to testify. One after another, they described her reputation for bullying. The most damning moment came from an elderly resident who recalled Margaret making her cry over something as trivial as the color of her mailbox flowers. Margaret's defense attorney tried to argue that she was simply fulfilling her duty to safeguard property values and uphold community standards. But the jury wasn't fooled. After only 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge handed down the sentence, 90 days in jail, suspended in favor of 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, ironically assigned at the local animal shelter, and $15,000 in damages payable to me for harassment and legal costs. Margaret's final performance was unforgettable. She stood at the podium, tears streaking her face, shouting that the board was dooming the neighborhood without her, insisting property values would nosedive, and declaring that my farm would ruin everything they had built. She clutched her laminated copy of the HOA bylaws like it was a holy text. When she refused to leave the stage, security was forced to escort her out, bylaws and all.